Welcome to our next breakout session here in the main ballroom to talk about maximizing business value as you migrate to AWS. Please welcome Randall Barnes.
Hi, everyone. Another packed house. I'm Randall Barnes, Solution Architect at the fanatical AWS support team at Rackspace. I've been in IT for quite some time, been working exclusively on the cloud for several years now, first at Microsoft and Azure, the last 3 years exclusively at migrating companies to AWS. I've been invited here to essentially give some information and lessons learned working in the trenches. I've moved over 200 companies into the cloud. Simple LAMP stacks all the way up to several thousand servers, entire data centers moved. And I certainly learned a few things along the way I'd love to share with you. Also have plenty of time left over for answering your very specific questions. So certainly all applications, large or small, have several interdependencies. It could be in terms of processes, the people, the teams that are working with applications, dependencies, interdependencies with partners and other data systems. So a lot of complexities. And there's also a lot of challenges. There we go. So some of the more, I'm sure you're familiar with all these challenges, and also wanted to also state that probably you're already sold on the benefits of the cloud, so I'm not here to talk about some of the advantages of being in the cloud. It's really more of the migration approach, what's worked well and what has not. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of challenges of where to start. What's the strategy? What's the process? We found that most of the challenges that you see here that you're familiar with are very resolvable. There's resources available, there's roadmap, there's generally other customers with similar workloads that have migrated and so forth. I found as probably the one and only biggest challenge that is not resolvable is lack of a clear executive sponsorship or support from senior management. For some reason, that just seems to be the not having a clear vision, not having a clear objective or timeline or budget approval from the high levels of your organization has been a blocker. I think also in practical terms, there's always contention between, not always, but often contention between some of the business units, the central IT staff and so forth, and just having that tiebreaker status to resolve issues is very, very important. And that's been the one area of all the migrations I've been experienced in that has been the biggest blocker of not having that clear leadership or sponsorship from an organization of the objective and the authority to implement those changes. In terms of a strategy, a migration roadmap, AWS does provide some information and a framework. If some of you might be familiar with TOGAF or some of the other large frameworks of project management and strategy and so forth, AWS, they do provide some of this information. It's relatively high level, as you can imagine. Some white papers, a couple of case studies and so forth, but it's really not giving a lot of practical information that you would need to kind of understand what the technical challenges, processes, options are, and so forth. So really, it's good for maybe some of the larger organizations. If you have partners, you need to coordinate with roles and responsibilities and so forth. Might be a good place to start to do a little reading, but not a lot of practical information that I've found that's been helpful for some of the hands-on work that's required. Certainly, there's a lot of ways to move your applications and workloads into the cloud and into AWS. The objective would be to have a successful migration to minimize risk, minimize security vulnerabilities, and so forth. There are different approaches that most companies and organizations have used in the past. Certainly, in terms of some workloads don't make sense in the cloud. It doesn't make financial sense if they're end of life or the particular platform would be so complex or expensive to try and migrate or move from a data center. I've also found probably as much as 30 or 40% of workloads or hosts or servers that were on the list to migrate when the analysis or assessment or more careful examination was performed, were deemed to be not needed anymore. So it's kind of a good way to clean your closet, either end of life or retire some systems. We're essentially left with refactoring, re-architecting, re-engineering your application, which can be a fair amount of work to achieve the benefits of the cloud, or do more of a lift and shift and move entire workloads or entire data centers into the cloud. And there's kind of a debate on what's more effective, what's more appropriate for individual workloads or companies. And I've seen it work both ways. And I must say that the refactoring, re-architecting, even for small independent workloads, has been quite a challenge to make that transition into the cloud, into a new platform, and often it's not the best strategy. So again, most of the workload migrations into AWS to achieve those goals of a successful migration and mitigating risks, minimizing risk, would be either a lift and shift type approach where you're essentially taking an entire ecosystem or application stack, moving it into AWS as is, making minor modifications either to eliminate a particular technical blocker, for example, a shared storage type implementation that doesn't work well in the cloud, or the re-architect, as we mentioned, to actually do some refactoring of your application, take advantage of some of the services and some of the built-in redundancy and other features that AWS allows. So when we talk about re-architecting, it's really being able to achieve the elasticity, the scalability of the cloud, being able to dynamically size your resources to match your load, minimizing costs, to be able to take advantage of a stateless architecture to facilitate that agility and scalability. Replatforming would be, again, minimizing the change or alteration of your application stack, using either tools to use your virtual or physical machine migration. You can automate that process and greatly accelerate the time to actually move to the cloud. Could be a lot of motivations there. Right off the bat, it could be a much less expensive experience to migrate out of an existing colo facility or data center. We've also had several customers that can immediately achieve a higher level of security certification and compliance. AWS as an infrastructure is already SOC 2 compliant, PCI compliant, HIPAA compliant. So we found many customers, whether in the financial services or health care space, moving to AWS or some portion of their applications ends up being immediately compliant in a much more faster pace or timeline than they could have retrofitted or made the changes in their existing facilities. So in addition to achieving some benefits right away, also able to reach a higher level of security compliance right away. So again, it's kind of a big trade-off. Most of the companies I've worked with, the applications we've moved, it's been a big consideration of re-architecting, taking the time to iterate through particular workloads, maybe having a distributed environment, and some complexities of having additional bandwidth constraints and so forth, versus moving larger portions of their entire workloads more quickly and then iterating on that. And we found, certainly my experience, the most successful migrations to achieve the objectives would be to really focus on the migration initially, to minimize the risk of making too many changes, introducing too many factors in the equation, straining the limits of the team ability to make the migration, as well as making any sort of improvements or optimizations. When the migration is complete, then there's certainly ability to optimize and then later make transformation in a more iterative approach. We'll talk about that. So what does a lift and shift migration typically look like? It would be essentially extending some of your core services, so your management or authentication mechanisms into a cloud environment. Very typically, that's with a VPN or dedicated circuit, and then having the ability to actually move entire workloads in waves into a pre-existing network definition into AWS. Some of the big advantages of this approach of moving large workloads would be AWS provides several built-in tools to actually migrate an entire VM. There's some third-party tools that work extremely well in migrating at an OS level and a block level entire systems into AWS. You can have nearly an immediate DNS change and have your end users utilizing these applications after a migration window overnight or over the weekend. Some of the biggest challenges we've seen with this would be having the bandwidth, having either a dedicated pipe or VPN connection that can handle one-time migration of large amounts of VMs or data snapshots into AWS. So certainly a consideration there. We talked about some of the immediate benefits, potential for reduced cost, and of course agility and the security as well. One of the other aspects would be the ability to replicate that footprint once it's in AWS for a global coverage, being able to leverage the existing multi-data center, multi-region approach of AWS to be able to immediately extend the coverage of your application and content. So AWS, again, makes it easy for this process with utilizing the base services of migrating VMs or physical systems into the infrastructure. In terms of networking to facilitate integration with your existing network equipment and processes. So the next phase would be, I'd say, optimization. This would be really right-sizing the environment. One of the goals of moving to the cloud would be to allocate and utilize just as many resources and the level of resources that you need when you need it, pay for what you use and no more. So the optimization phase really would be using AWS built-in tools for trend analysis of your application itself, understanding the utilization trends to right-size the physical systems or the virtual systems. We found that probably 80% or more of your costs of the cloud is directly tied to the size of the virtual machine you're running and the number of hours it's running. So simply having a little bit of time to have your applications running in the cloud, you can immediately leverage some of the built-in monitoring and metric analytics tools to be able to appropriately change the size of your instance and the quantity of some of the systems that are running. It's a simple process, generally a simple reboot, a simple maintenance window, and you can resize appropriately and realize a significant cost savings. So another aspect of this optimization phase would be to have your teams become familiar with the processes and how things are done in AWS, becoming familiar with the deployment and management tools, and start to leverage some of the services that essentially transition your team from being sysadmins and concentrating on some of the more data center-centric tasks into actually focusing on the application tier. So leveraging some of the AWS managed services like their database systems and some of their other systems that essentially allow your teams to no longer have to manage with patching and so forth. It's a very easy kind of transition for your central IT teams. Lastly, the transformation phase. We found that most attempts at re-engineering, re-architecting workloads when they're in their legacy environment is extremely challenging to make that jump from an existing environment into the cloud at the same time re-architecting and minimizing the impact and risk to the other applications and so forth. But once you're in the cloud, once you've optimized from a platform level, certainly targeting specific workloads specific application stacks that is within the capability of the resource constraints of your team. Some of the big areas we'd found would be to move your application tiers into a stateless environment where the session data or user data or any other stateful data is stored in a centralized repository. This allows the ability, whether it's an application server, web server, to be able to scale up and down dynamically. This scalability is built into AWS. It's a very easy process if you've already made the migration of your application into a stateless format. So that's certainly a big area. Another would be to essentially move to a serverless architecture, leveraging some of the containers and ability to run code or execute code on demand, and no longer have to manage the OS level itself. So these sorts of refactoring and re-architecture certainly require focused effort and energy from your teams, and we found that, again, at the later phases of a full migration is where you're going to be the most successful in actually meeting your objectives without risk to the business. And so again, to reiterate, I found it been most successful having the approach of a lift and shift, moving to the cloud, getting comfortable with the cloud, optimizing the environments and taking advantage of some of the platform improvements and enhancements, and then finally iterating through an application transform. Also can be looked at as maintaining services, minimizing risk as you make the migration, and then focusing on the innovation. So that is the conclusion of my brief presentation. Any questions? Yes.
So one of our concerns looking at Amazon, particularly when you start looking at embedding with their specific solutions, is basically the fear of vendor lock-in. How do you tend to think about that?
So the question is a concern about vendor lock-in. AWS, as you might imagine, they've got hundreds and now numbering into the thousands of different services and features and so forth. And they've done a pretty good job of maintaining kind of neutrality and supporting many of their open source platforms, or taking a commercial platform and supporting it within their virtualized environment. That being said, there are several examples where they have customized, and I can certainly say that it's not for an attempt of vendor lock-in, but DynamoDB versus MongoDB is a good example of certainly a different model. It's certainly a different API, and example of the risks to your business of adopting that platform is really on a case-by-case basis. What I found in terms of, there's certainly been many examples of keeping an open source or commercial type platform on the EC2, the virtual machine platform, and managing it yourself to have the ability to have a more portable application stack that you can move to Azure or back into another cloud or dedicated environment. So we certainly see that a fair amount, whether you're running a particular version of Linux and not adopting Amazon's version. There are some trade-offs there in terms of performance and cost, but it does give you that portability, and it's generally on a case-by-case basis what's important to you in your business. Any other questions? Yes. So I believe the question was that AWS has a storefront for information and so forth, and I am not familiar with that. I apologize. Okay. I'm sorry? And training. I'm not familiar with that. AWS, they do an excellent job of providing documentation, information. They even have some basic training courses and so forth, whether virtually or on-site. But I found that that's generally where they leave you at that point. So they do have a small professional services organization, but really, their goal is self-service. So being able to leverage examples of similar applications that you may be migrating, finding those case studies online, or reaching out and talking to someone such as myself, who that's my business, is helping move these applications and workloads, and finding the gotchas and so forth, certainly helpful. But from a basic training standpoint and information, AWS, they do a good job of having that information available. I think the pace of releasing their products can generally outstrip their ability to have time-relevant material posted. So that's also kind of another concern. Yes? Absolutely. So the question is, what are the thresholds? What's the determining factor of what's worthwhile or what's not? A good question. There's always a cost to migration. There's always a risk to migration, whether it's to AWS or any other platform. So that must be factored into it. I think, believe it or not, cost savings is a big, but probably not the majority of reasons that most applications are migrated. I'd say a significant part of that would be security, which is interesting because, up until I'd say this year, most people just assumed it was less secure in the cloud, and they were afraid to move to the cloud. And now I think they realize that as a managed infrastructure, that's very secure and solid, and then it's up to them, whether it's in their own data center or in the cloud or a multi-tenant environment. Security is a big thing, so if that's a factor, if it's easier to have a HIPAA compliant or PCI compliant workload in AWS, then that's a very easy, decision to make. In terms of costs, AWS, they're very transparent on their costs in terms of what would it cost to leverage this number of systems, this size, this amount of data, this kind of bandwidth. It's a pretty easy comparison to do that. There's generally very little risk. I've found from experience that from a CPU or RAM kind of standpoint, that's going to be apples to apples to almost any other platform. From a disk I/O, if you've got a data-centric workload, then you generally have to pad that cost in AWS. Their volumes are generally slower than most other options you're used to. But even still, that's a pretty tangible way of getting that cost under control. I think that another motivation we hadn't talked about would be, as part of that optimization and replatforming, moving from a high license commercial product into an open source, whether it's a particular managed platform that AWS manages and you have the risk of vendor lock-in, or simply moving. One of our biggest requests or biggest activities would be taking an Oracle platform with some obviously tremendously high licensing costs and migrating that into MySQL or Aurora. So moving to the cloud, not just the initial lift and shift workload, but that eventual, after an iteration of improvement or refactoring, what's that target cost? And if you're looking 12, 24, 36 months down the road, then that's kind of part of that migration investment. So if that helps. But in terms of if you're looking at that cost threshold, what does it cost to migrate? You can certainly, if you're doing it yourself, probably calculate what the impact to your team and time is. If you're hiring someone, anyone reputable should give you a pretty accurate idea of what that would be. And then the cost differential of what you're running on premise or a colo or some other type of facility versus what AWS would be. It's generally pretty easy to determine. Just pad the disk I/O for any of your data-centric applications. Any questions? Absolutely. So the question is, if a decision is made to move to AWS, and perhaps you're an existing Rackspace customer, what is our position on that, or what is that?
Yeah, so if we wanted to take an on-premise server and migrate it over to AWS, is Rackspace a partner with AWS where you help facilitate that?
Absolutely. My team, a solution architect team, we exist for no cost to you to help with a detailed level design or specification of what is an optimal best practice design in AWS versus where you might be today, whether it's Rackspace or somewhere else. Make strong recommendations on migration strategies, essentially what we just talked about today, but in very low-level detail about, for example, migration waves, type of smoke testing tools that might be available and so forth, to have the migration strategy as well. I mean, the end goal is we still want to provide that fanatical support, whether you're on dedicated private cloud or AWS or Azure. And that's part of my team is essentially help you with that transition and migration. And the VPC part? Absolutely. So the virtual networking is part of the design. So again, the detailed level design of here's your workload, here's some enhancements you're thinking about, or here's something new. What would that look like in AWS? My team absolutely would help, at no cost, would help with a recommendation of what that design would look like.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? Sorry, it's hard to see in the light. Okay, well, thank you again, Randall Barnes. I'll be here for any other targeted questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Randall. Coming up at 4:10, our next breakout session will be Daniel Clayton, a new approach to cyber hunting in the age of advanced persistent threats. So Daniel Clayton speaking on security coming up at 4:10 this afternoon in this room, and other breakout sessions also resuming at 4:10.